A successful black businessman boards a first-class flight, ready to head home after weeks away. But what starts as a routine journey quickly takes a shocking turn. A fellow passenger questions his right to be there, escalating into a tense confrontation that leaves the entire cabin stunned. Just moments later, the tables turn in a way no one could have predicted, leaving everyone on the flight rethinking their assumptions. What happens next is a lesson in resilience and grace that you won't forget. Stay with me, because this story is one you need to hear. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more eye-opening content. It all started on what seemed like an ordinary flight. Elijah Wright adjusted the strap of his well-worn leather briefcase as he stepped through the sliding glass doors of the airport terminal. The air inside was cool, tinged with the faint scent of coffee and jet fuel, mingling with the low hum of travelers in motion. It was a space he had come to know well over the years. One where the world felt suspended in liminality. A place where everyone seemed to be heading somewhere but rarely paused to acknowledge anyone else. His tailored suit, perfectly pressed, clung to him like armor, each thread woven with stories of perseverance and purpose. He'd worn suits like this in rooms where he wasn't expected, where the weight of a first impression felt more like a test than an introduction. As he moved through the terminal, Elijah couldn't help but notice the subtle glances. They were fleeting but pointed, eyes flickering from his face to his shoes to the briefcase at his side. A silent inventory, a question hanging in the air. Who are you? And why are you here? He kept walking, the sound of his leather soles meeting the polished tiles a steady rhythm, matching the pulse of his thoughts. He wasn't imagining the looks, he'd seen them too many times to dismiss them now. In a country that had promised progress, some questions were still asked without words. Elijah stopped at a kiosk to check his boarding pass. The machine whirred softly, spitting out a receipt for his first-class seat. As he tucked it into his jacket pocket, a young woman approached the neighboring kiosk, her eyes darting nervously as she swiped her card. She glanced at him briefly and then away, her shoulders stiffening slightly. Elijah recognized the gesture. He'd lived inside it. He wanted to say something, to break the tension with a simple acknowledgement. But what would that accomplish? He'd learned long ago that there were battles worth fighting and others best left untouched. So instead, he nodded politely and moved on, letting her discomfort pass unchallenged. At the security checkpoint, the unspoken escalated into something tangible. Elijah placed his briefcase on the conveyor belt, his watch and shoes following. The TSA agent waved him forward, and he stepped into the scanner, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The agent, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, studied the monitor. A faint frown crossed his face as he signaled Elijah to step aside. Random screening, the agent said, the words as rehearsed as the tight smile that followed. Elijah held the man's gaze for a moment longer than necessary, searching for something, an apology, an acknowledgement, anything. Instead, he found only the kind of weary detachment that came from doing this job too many times. To too many people, for too many years. He compiled without complaint, stepping to the side as another agent began rifling through his briefcase. The contents were as unremarkable as they were personal: a laptop, a notebook filled with his handwriting, and a novel he'd been trying to finish for weeks. Heading somewhere important? The agent asked, holding up the book as though it might explain why Elijah was standing there. Home, Elijah said simply, his voice steady. The agent didn't respond, handing the book back with a shrug. Elijah gathered his things and walked away, feeling the burn of invisible eyes on his back. He reached the gate 20 minutes before boarding. The lounge, a carefully curated oasis of comfort and exclusivity, was sparsely populated. Elijah handed his boarding pass to the attendant, a young man whose bright smile dimmed slightly as he took in Elijah's appearance. Mr. Wright, the man said after a beat, recovering his professional tone. Welcome. Can I get you anything while you wait? Elijah declined, taking a seat by the window where the planes lined up like restless giants waiting their turn. He glanced around the room, noting the polished shoes, the crisp suits, and the quiet, unspoken camaraderie of the frequent flyers. These were his peers now. Or so he'd been told. But the room still felt like a proving ground. As though he had to do more than pay for his ticket to earn his place here. Outside, the sky was a pale shade of morning blue, streaked with thin clouds that stretched toward the horizon. Elijah watched a plane taxi to the runway, its engines roaring to life. Soon, he murmured to himself, thinking of his wife and children waiting at home. The announcement for priority boarding came over the intercom, breaking his reverie. Elijah gathered his things and made his way to the gate, joining the line of first-class passengers. A man in front of him, tall and broad-shouldered, turned slightly, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Elijah. "Are you in the wrong line?" the man asked, his tone casual but laced with something sharper. Elijah's grip on his briefcase tightened. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that had carried him through 1,000 such moments. "No," he said evenly, holding up his boarding pass. "I'm right where I'm supposed to be." The man's expression faltered for a fraction of a second before he turned away. His muttered response lost in the shuffle of feet moving forward. Elijah stepped onto the jet bridge, his pulse steady but his thoughts restless. He had a seat waiting for him. 2A, window. He would take it. He would sit in it. He would exist in it. Because some battles weren't chosen, but they were worth fighting all the same. Elijah stepped onto the plane, greeted by the polished warmth of the first-class cabin. The smell of leather seats mingled with the faint aroma of fresh coffee brewing in the galley. The flight attendant at the door, a woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a name tag that read Laura, smiled mechanically. It was a smile he'd seen countless times before. Pleasant but distant, professional but not inviting. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Wright," she said after a brief glance at his boarding pass, her eyes flicking to his face for just a moment too long. "Thank you," he replied with quiet composure, the weight of her hesitation settling somewhere deep in his chest. His seat, 2A, was by the window, just as he'd requested. Elijah placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment and lowered himself into the plush leather seat, adjusting his tie as he exhaled. The noise of the boarding passengers faded slightly as he pulled out a notebook from his bag. The words on its pages, meeting notes, half-formed ideas, sketches of planes, grounded him. The first-class cabin began to fill. A man in a pinstriped suit and expensive cologne took the seat across the aisle. A woman in pearl earrings and a neatly tailored jacket slid into the seat directly behind Elijah. The atmosphere hummed with the subtle energy of wealth and success, an air of exclusivity that seemed to vibrate just slightly off-key with his presence. It began with a look, a glance from the man in the pinstriped suit. At first, it was quick, almost imperceptible, but then it lingered, his brow furrowing ever so slightly as his gaze moved from Elijah's face to his notebook to the monogram on his briefcase. Elijah didn't need to look up to feel the weight of the man's silent questions. "What are you doing here?" The unspoken tension grew as the flight attendant moved through the cabin offering pre-flight drinks. When she reached Elijah, her tone was polite but guarded. "Can I get you anything to drink, sir?" "Sparkling water, please," Elijah said evenly, his voice calm but firm, as if it might smooth the rough edges of her hesitation. Across the aisle, the man in the pinstripe suit ordered a scotch, his eyes drifting toward Elijah's seat once again. The flight attendant glanced between them before retreating to the galley, her posture stiff with unacknowledged discomfort. Moments later, another passenger arrived, a middle-aged man with graying temples and an air of entitlement that preceded him. His name was Charles, as Elijah would later learn. Charles walked the aisle with the practiced ease of someone who believed the world belonged to him. His eyes scanned the cabin until they landed on Elijah, and his expression tightened. Charles stopped in front of Elijah's seat, holding his boarding pass like a badge of authority. "Excuse me," Charles said, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of nearby passengers. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Elijah looked up slowly, meeting Charles's gaze with steady calm. "Yes, I'm sure," he said, holding up his own boarding pass. Charles hesitated, his eyes flicking to the seat number above Elijah's head and then back to Elijah's face. "Well," he said, his tone laced with condescension, "mistakes happen. Let's just have the flight attendant confirm. Shall we?" The flight attendant, Laura, returned at Charles's summons. Her expression faltered for a brief moment when she realized the source of the commotion but quickly returned to its polished neutrality. "Is there a problem?" she asked, looking between Elijah and Charles. "I believe this gentleman might be in the wrong seat," Charles said, gesturing toward Elijah with an air of forced politeness. Elijah remained seated, his face calm but his jaw tight. He handed his boarding pass to Laura without a word. She scanned it quickly, her expression shifting as she turned to Charles. "Mr. Wright is in the correct seat," she said, her voice clipped but professional. 2A is his assigned seat. Charles blinked, clearly caught off guard. "I see," he said slowly, his voice stiff with embarrassment. "My mistake." But instead of apologizing, he muttered something about standards not being what they used to be, as he moved toward his own seat. The tension in the cabin was palpable now. Like the static charge before a storm, Elijah could feel the glances from other passengers. Curious, cautious, complicit. No one spoke, but the weight of their silence was deafening. He opened his notebook again. Though the words on the page had lost their clarity, the commotion had passed, but the unease lingered, settling into the fabric of the space like an unwelcome guest. Through the window, Elijah watched the airport ground crew moving with quiet efficiency, their bright vests a stark contrast to the muted tones of the first-class cabin. He thought about his children, Marcus and Olivia, and the conversations they would one day need to have. Conversations about dignity, about resilience, about how to navigate spaces that weren't always welcoming. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their departure. Elijah leaned back in his seat, gripping the armrest lightly as the plane began to taxi. The cabin grew quieter, but the unspoken questions lingered in the air, heavy and persistent. Elijah knew this wasn't the last challenge he'd face on this flight. The day was just beginning, and the tension was far from resolved. The plane ascended, its engines humming as it broke through the thick clouds and into the open sky. The initial rush of takeoff faded, replaced by the familiar steadiness of cruising altitude. Elijah Wright gazed out of the window, the world below reduced to a patchwork quilt of greens, browns, and grays. From up here, everything looked so small, so unified, lines blurred, borders invisible. Yet within the confines of the first-class cabin, the divides felt sharper than ever. The tension didn't take long to resurface. It began with subtle movements. The shuffling of papers, the deliberate opening of a laptop. Across the aisle, Charles Harrington, his earlier assumptions now bruised, pretended to read a financial report. But his eyes wandered back to Elijah, his glances tinged with something too deliberate to be casual. Charles seemed to be wrestling with an unspoken question, his discomfort radiating outward like ripples in a still pond. The quiet war of perception played out around them. The man in the pinstriped suit leaned slightly into the aisle, his body angled as though to block a line of sight between Elijah and the rest of the cabin. Behind him, the woman with the pearl earrings whispered to her seatmate, her lips barely moving, but her glances toward Elijah spoke volumes. Elijah could feel their attention like heat, pressing against his skin. It wasn't the overt hostility he'd faced in younger years, when people spat their disdain openly. This was quieter, more insidious. It was the kind of prejudice that pretended to be invisible but left fingerprints on everything it touched. The flight attendant returned, her tray balanced with practiced ease. She moved through the aisle, distributing drinks and snacks with a smile that now seemed brittle. The kind of smile designed to pacify more than welcome. "Another sparkling water, Mr. Wright?" she asked, her tone overly bright. "Yes, thank you," Elijah replied, his voice even, as she handed him the glass. Her fingers hesitated for the briefest of moments, brushing his hand. It was nothing, really, but it felt like everything. He saw her eyes dart toward Charles, then back to him, her expression an unreadable mask of conflict. Charles, for his part, let out an audible sigh. "Quite the personalized service," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Elijah didn't respond. He'd spent a lifetime choosing his battles, and he knew better than to let a comment like that derail him. Still, the moment clung to the air like damp mist, impossible to ignore. Elijah opened his notebook again, flipping to a blank page. He began jotting down thoughts. Notes for the meeting he'd just left. Ideas for the next project. The act of writing calmed him, focusing his energy on something productive. But as his pen moved across the paper, his mind drifted. He thought of his son, Marcus, who at 10 years old was already asking questions Elijah had hoped to delay. "Dad, why do people act funny around us sometimes?" Marcus had asked one evening, his voice tinged with confusion. Elijah had struggled to find the right words, torn between protecting his son's innocence and preparing him for a world that wouldn't always be kind. "It's not about you, son," he'd said eventually. "Sometimes people see what they want to see, not who you really are. Your job is to never let that change how you see yourself." The words had felt inadequate then. And now, sitting in this cabin, they felt even more so. How many times had he told himself the same thing, trying to hold on to his dignity while the world chipped away at it? One glance, one comment, one assumption at a time? A commotion in the aisle jolted him from his thoughts. A young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, was struggling with her bag, which had slipped from the overhead compartment. She was wearing a hoodie with a tech company logo, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. Elijah stood instinctively, catching the bag before it hit the floor. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice breathless with relief. "No problem," Elijah said, handing it back to her. The interaction was simple, ordinary, yet, as Elijah returned to his seat, he felt the weight of the cabin's collective gaze. The act of standing, of being seen, seemed to unsettle the delicate balance of their discomfort. The young woman, now seated a few rows ahead, turned back to look at him. "I think I've read about you," she said hesitantly. "Morgan Wright Partners, right? The investment firm?" Elijah nodded, surprised. "That's right. I read your article on ethical investing," she continued, her voice growing more confident. "It was inspiring. The way you're using capital to create opportunities. It's rare." Her words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. Elijah could see the reactions ripple through the cabin. Charles's posture stiffened. The woman with the pearl earrings lowered her magazine, pretending not to listen but clearly absorbing every word. For a moment, Elijah felt a small flicker of hope. Here was a stranger, someone from a different generation, recognizing his work for what it was. But the hope was fleeting, eclipsed by the weight of Charles's muttered response. "Well, isn't that nice?" Charles said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. A bit of self-promotion never hurt anyone. Elijah turned his head slowly, meeting Charles's gaze directly for the first time since the flight began. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with quiet intensity. "It's not self-promotion," Elijah said evenly. "It's about creating space for people who've been told there isn't room for them. Including this one." Charles blinked, caught off guard by the response. For a moment, the cabin was silent, the hum of the engines the only sound. The flight continued, but the mood in the cabin had shifted. The quiet tension that had defined the earlier moments now carried a charge. As though something fragile had cracked open, Elijah returned to his notebook. But he couldn't focus. He wasn't angry. Anger was too easy. What he felt was deeper, heavier. As the plane leveled off, Elijah thought again of Marcus and Olivia. What kind of world would they inherit? Would they have to endure the same invisible battles, the same constant calculations? Or would the ripples of moments like this, small but significant, make things just a little easier for them? Elijah straightened in his seat, his pen poised above the paper. He wasn't sure how to answer those questions. But he knew one thing for certain: the fight wasn't over. It never was. The hum of the engines faded into the background, but the tension in the first-class cabin thickened like a storm cloud waiting to break. Elijah sat still, his notebook open on his lap, though his pen hovered motionless above the page. His earlier calm felt distant now, eroded by the undercurrent of unspoken judgments and muffled hostility around him. Charles Harrington sat rigidly in his seat, his body a study in discomfort. He fidgeted with the in-flight magazine, his movements sharp and deliberate, as if the mere act of turning pages could drown out the presence of the man he had tried and failed to dismiss. Across the aisle, the woman with the pearl earrings glanced between them, her face betraying a mix of curiosity and unease. She shifted in her seat, her polished exterior cracking under the weight of the cabin's silence. Elijah could feel it all, the stolen glances, the unspoken words, the careful avoidance of direct confrontation. It was the kind of tension that didn't need to be named to be understood. A tension that carried the weight of history, of assumptions, of lives lived in parallel but never truly intersecting. The flight attendant, Laura, reappeared with a tray of drinks, her steps faltering slightly as she approached Elijah's row. She smiled tightly, the kind of smile that tried to smooth over awkwardness without acknowledging its cause. "Mr. Wright, would you care for another drink?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "No, thank you," Elijah said politely, sensing her relief as she moved on. As Laura leaned toward Charles, offering him another scotch, he shook his head brusquely, his irritation barely concealed. "You're very attentive today," Charles said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Perhaps too much so. The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Laura's smile faltered, and she quickly turned away, retreating toward the galley. Elijah clenched his fists beneath the fold-down tray, his calm exterior hiding the storm building within. He thought of Marcus, his son, who often asked why the world seemed so complicated. "Why do people act like that, Dad?" Marcus would ask, his young voice filled with bewilderment. Elijah had always tried to answer with honesty, to explain without passing on the bitterness he worked so hard to keep at bay. But what would he say now? How could he explain moments like these, where the lines between subtle prejudice and outright disrespect blurred into an exhausting haze? The young woman in the tech hoodie, Sophia, as Elijah had learned earlier, turned in her seat again. She seemed hesitant, her gaze flickering between Elijah and Charles as though weighing the risks of speaking. "I thought your article on ethical investing was incredible," she said finally, her voice breaking the silence. Elijah offered a small smile. "Thank you. It's a subject I care deeply about." Her words seemed to shift something in the cabin. A businessman in his 40s, seated 2 rows ahead, turned slightly, his curiosity piqued. "Ethical investing?" the man asked, his voice carrying a practiced smoothness. "What does that entail?" Elijah glanced at Charles, who was now staring out the window, his scowl deepening. "It's about balancing profit with purpose," Elijah explained. "Investing in projects that not only generate returns but also create opportunities and address systemic inequalities." The businessman nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds like a challenge, but necessary." "It is," Elijah replied. "But challenges are where change begins." The conversation grew, drawing in others. Sophia spoke animatedly about her own work in tech and how she admired companies like Elijah's for prioritizing diversity in their investments. The businessman shared his interest in expanding his portfolio into clean energy, sparking a lively discussion about innovation and responsibility. Even the woman with the pearl earrings joined in, asking Elijah about his background and how he had started his firm. Her questions were cautious but genuine, and Elijah answered with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years navigating these spaces. The cabin began to feel lighter, the earlier tension dissolving into something resembling camaraderie. Yet, through it all, Elijah couldn't ignore the quiet figure of Charles, who remained seated in stony silence. His earlier arrogance had crumbled, replaced by a defensive stillness that spoke louder than words. As the conversation waned, the flight attendant returned, this time with a tray of warm towels. She paused by Elijah's seat, her expression softer now, as though the shift in the cabin had reached her as well. "Here you are, Mr. Wright," she said, her tone almost apologetic. "Thank you," Elijah said, his voice warm but measured. When Laura handed a towel to Charles, he accepted it without a word. His face turned resolutely away from Elijah. The small acts of service, the quiet exchanges, all seemed to carry an extra weight now. Elijah knew this wasn't just about a drink or a towel. It was about recognition, about the subtle ways dignity was either granted or withheld in spaces like these. As the plane cruised through the sky, Elijah thought about the invisible lines that had been drawn and redrawn throughout his life. Lines that determined who belonged where, who was welcome and who was merely tolerated. He thought about how those lines seemed to shift depending on what he wore, what he carried, or how much money he had in the bank. The cabin was quiet again. But this time the silence felt different. It wasn't the charged silence of discomfort but something more contemplative, as though the air itself had absorbed the weight of the conversations that had passed through it. Elijah leaned back in his seat, his notebook open on his lap. He began to write, his pen moving across the page with steady purpose. The words came easily now, each one a reflection of the world he navigated. A world where progress was measured not in grand gestures but in the quiet breaking of barriers. One conversation, one moment at a time. As the flight progressed, the tension that had softened briefly began to coil itself again, weaving into the fabric of the cabin. It wasn't loud or obvious. There were no arguments or raised voices. But Elijah Wright could feel it. It was in the air, in the way Charles Harrington shifted in his seat with exaggerated motions. The way his eyes scanned the cabin but never quite landed on Elijah. Elijah noticed how Charles occasionally glanced toward the group that had begun to orbit him. The businessman, the young tech developer, and even the woman with the pearls. The ease with which they engaged Elijah now seemed to irritate Charles. As though they had violated an unspoken code. The subtle conflict came to a head when the flight attendant reappeared. This time offering snack options. Laura moved methodically down the aisle, her demeanor warm but carefully calibrated. When she reached Elijah's seat, her smile was tentative, her voice quieter than before. "Would you like anything else, Mr. Wright?" Before Elijah could respond, Charles interjected from across the aisle. "I must say," he began, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw attention. "It's rare to see such attentive service. Very rare indeed." The comment was directed at no one in particular. But its target was clear. Elijah turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting Charles's with the weight of restrained patience. He wanted to say something. Wanted to call out the thinly veiled insinuation. But years of practice held him back. Instead, he simply shook his head. "No, thank you," Elijah said to Laura, his voice calm and steady. Charles smirked, satisfied with his disruption. But Elijah didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. The cabin had grown quieter, the earlier conversations tapering off as passengers became aware of the growing tension. Elijah noticed the woman with the pearls shift uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers fiddling with the clasp of her necklace. Sophia, the tech developer, looked between Elijah and Charles, her expression a mix of concern and uncertainty. It was the businessman, Tom, as he'd introduced himself earlier, who broke the silence. "I don't think I caught the name of your firm," Tom said to Elijah, his voice steady but pointed. "What was it again?" "Morgan Wright Partners," Elijah replied, his tone even. "Ah, yes," Tom said, leaning forward slightly. "I've heard about your work in clean energy. Impressive portfolio." "Thank you," Elijah said, grateful for the shift in focus but aware of the undercurrent driving it. The conversation that followed felt deliberate, almost performative, as though Tom was trying to counterbalance Charles's hostility. Sophia chimed in with questions about Elijah's investment strategies, her enthusiasm genuine but edged with a hint of defensiveness, as if she too wanted to take a stand without making it explicit. Charles, however, was not one to let the spotlight shift so easily. "Clean energy, you say?" he asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Sounds ambitious." Elijah looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Ambition is necessary for progress." Charles laughed, a low, dismissive sound. "Progress," he echoed, shaking his head. "It's a nice word, but it doesn't always mean what people think it does." The remark hung in the air, its meaning ambiguous yet charged. The cabin grew still, the hum of the engines the only sound as passengers pretended not to listen. Elijah leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. He chose his words carefully, each one deliberate. "Progress," he said, his voice low but clear, "isn't always comfortable, but discomfort is where growth begins." Charles's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by something that might have been uncertainty. The flight attendant returned to collect empty glasses, her presence breaking the momentary stillness. Elijah handed her his water glass with a small nod. noticing the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for it. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. As she moved down the aisle, Elijah caught the eye of the woman with the pearls. She looked at him, her expression conflicted, as though she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "It's not always easy," she said finally, her voice hesitant. "Navigating all of this." "No," Elijah agreed, his tone measured. "It isn't." The rest of the flight passed in a kind of uneasy equilibrium. Conversations resumed but with less vigor. The earlier camaraderie dulled by the weight of what had transpired. Charles remained silent, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed on the window as though trying to distance himself from the cabin entirely. Elijah, meanwhile, returned to his notebook, his pen moving across the page in slow, deliberate strokes. He wasn't writing about the meeting he'd just left or the projects waiting for him back home. Instead, he was capturing the moment. The subtle shifts, the unspoken tensions, the quiet battles that defined so much of his life. He thought of Marcus and Olivia again, of the lessons he wanted to teach them about resilience, dignity, and the power of presence. He thought about the weight they would one day carry and how he could help lighten it. If only a little. By the time the captain announced their descent, Elijah felt the familiar mixture of relief and resolve. This flight was just one moment in a lifetime of moments. One chapter in a story that was far from over. As the plane began its descent, Elijah looked out the window. The city below coming into view. The world seemed smaller from up here, its divisions less visible, but as the plane prepared to land, Elijah knew that the challenges waiting on the ground would be as real as ever. The plane dipped slightly as it began its descent, and the familiar chime of the captain's voice broke through the cabin's quiet. Elijah Wright barely heard the announcement. His thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in the knot of unspoken tensions that had tightened throughout the flight. The brief moments of camaraderie earlier felt distant now, overshadowed by the simmering hostility from Charles Harrington and the hesitant discomfort from other passengers. Elijah had seen this dynamic too many times before. The sudden shift from polite indifference to awkward unease. The way suspicion lingered in the air long after the initial spark of conflict. But this time, something felt different. The tension wasn't just lingering. It was growing, feeding on the unspoken words and silent judgments that hung between them. It began again when Charles leaned toward the aisle, his voice cutting through the cabin with deliberate precision. "You know," he said, his tone feigning casualness but carrying an edge. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier. About progress and discomfort. It's interesting, isn't it? How people talk about progress as if it's always a good thing." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He closed his notebook carefully, setting it aside as he met Charles's gaze. "Progress," Elijah said evenly, "is about moving forward. It's not always easy, and it's not always comfortable. But it's necessary." Charles smirked, leaning back in his seat as though he'd been waiting for this opening. "Necessary for whom?" he asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like progress often comes at someone else's expense." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Elijah could feel the attention of the cabin shifting toward them, passengers straining to listen while pretending not to. "I suppose that depends on how you define expense," Elijah said, keeping his tone measured. "Progress isn't about taking from one to give to another. It's about creating opportunities that didn't exist before. It's about equity, not just equality." Charles scoffed, his expression tightening. "Equity," he repeated, as though the word itself was offensive. "It's a nice idea, but let's be honest. It's just a way of justifying taking more than what's earned." The remark landed like a slap, its implication as clear as its delivery. Elijah felt a flicker of anger rise in his chest. But he swallowed it down, channeling it into the calm resolve that had carried him through countless moments like this. "It's not about taking," Elijah said firmly. "It's about recognizing that the playing field hasn't been level for a long time. Equity means acknowledging the barriers that exist and working to remove them. Not for some, but for everyone." Sophia, the young tech developer, spoke up then, her voice hesitant but determined. "I think what Mr. Wright is saying makes sense," she said. "If we're not willing to address the inequalities built into our systems, then we're not really progressing at all. We're just maintaining the status quo. Her words seemed to embolden others. The businessman, Tom, nodded thoughtfully. It's true, he said. In my industry, I've seen how exclusion can stifle innovation. The more voices we include, the better our outcomes. The shift in the conversation was palpable, the cabin buzzing with a new energy. But Charles wasn't ready to back down. That's easy to say when you're not the one paying the price, he said, his voice rising slightly. Some of us have worked hard to build what we have. It's not fair to expect us to just hand it over. Elijah leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. No one's asking you to hand anything over, he said. What we're asking is that you recognize the systems that have made it easier for some and harder for others. It's not about blame. It's about responsibility. And if we want a better future, we all have to take responsibility for building it. Charles opened his mouth to respond. But before he could, another voice cut in. You know, said the woman with the pearls, her tone unexpectedly sharp. I've been sitting here listening to this, and I can't help but think about my father. He was a farmer in the South, worked harder than anyone I've ever known. But he used to say something I'll never forget. Hard work means nothing if the world's working against you. Her words landed with a weight that silenced the cabin. She looked at Elijah, her expression softening. You've worked hard too. I can see that, and I respect it. The atmosphere shifted again, the tension loosening slightly as the plane began its final descent. Elijah felt a flicker of gratitude for the woman's words, for the way she had stepped into the space between him and Charles. But as he looked around the cabin, he realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone watching, everyone listening, everyone who would carry this moment with them in some way. Charles muttered something under his breath, his frustration evident, but he didn't speak again. Retreating into his seat as the plane prepared to land, Elijah leaned back, exhaling slowly. The battle wasn't over. It never really was. But for now, the storm had passed. The cabin settled into a quiet hum, the weight of the exchange lingering but no longer suffocating. As the city came into view through the window, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was the work, not just the business deals or the investments, but the conversations, the challenges, the small moments of progress that pushed the world forward. Inch by inch, the plane descended steadily, its engines humming with the kind of certainty that belied the quiet unease in the cabin. Elijah Wright gazed out the window at the city below, its sprawling grid of lights stretching into the horizon. The beauty of the view was undeniable. Yet Elijah's mind remained tethered to the invisible lines drawn within the cabin. Lines that divided more than they connected. Behind him, Charles Harrington sat stiffly, his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on the seat in front of him. He had not spoken since the conversation about equity and progress had ended. But his silence carried its own weight. Elijah could feel it like an anchor pulling against the fragile calm that had settled over the cabin. The flight attendant, Laura, returned to collect final drink glasses and prepare the cabin for landing. Her movements were efficient, but her expression betrayed a quiet tension. When she reached Charles's seat, he handed her his empty glass with a curt nod, his face set in a mask of disapproval. Thank you, Laura said, her voice polite but strained. She turned to Elijah, her expression softening as she addressed him. Mr. Wright, is there anything else I can get you before we land? No, thank you, Elijah said, offering a small smile. Her response was almost imperceptible. A nod, a momentary hesitation, as though she wanted to say more but thought better of it. Elijah recognized the look. It was the same one he'd seen in countless faces over the years, an unspoken acknowledgement of the tension, accompanied by the silent question of whether she could, or should, do more. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane made its final approach, the city lights below casting a soft glow through the windows. Elijah opened his notebook, intending to jot down a few thoughts about the meeting he'd attended earlier. But his pen remained still. Instead, his mind drifted to the events of the past few hours, the subtle slights, the moments of connection, and the undercurrent of resistance that had coursed through it all. He thought of Marcus and Olivia, his children, and the world they were growing up in. How would he explain this flight to them? How could he help them navigate a world that would question their worth even as they worked tirelessly to prove it? The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jostling passengers in their seats. A soft gasp rippled through the cabin, followed by nervous laughter. Elijah remained still, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He'd been through worse, both in the air and on the ground. The turbulence passed quickly, but it seemed to shake something loose in the cabin. Sophia, the young tech developer, turned to Elijah again, her voice hesitant but determined. "I just want to say," she began, "that I really admire what you're doing. It's not easy to talk about these things, but it's so important." Elijah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you," he said. "It's important, but it's never easy." The woman with the pearls leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It shouldn't have to be so hard," she said softly, her voice tinged with regret. "But I suppose change never comes easy. Does it?" "No," Elijah replied. "It doesn't, but that doesn't mean it's not worth pursuing." From behind them, Charles let out a sharp laugh, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Change," he muttered, shaking his head. "Always change. And yet things seem to stay the same. Don't they?" Elijah turned slightly, meeting Charles's gaze. "Change takes time," he said evenly, "and it takes effort. But it does happen, if we're willing to work for it." Charles leaned back in his seat, his expression skeptical. "Easy for you to say," he replied. "You've clearly done well for yourself. But for the rest of us? Change usually means giving up something we've worked hard for." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Change doesn't mean taking away from one to give to another," he said. "It means creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to succeed. Not just the ones who were born with an advantage." The plane began its final descent, the seatbelt sign dinging on as passengers adjusted their belongings and prepared for landing. The atmosphere in the cabin felt charged, as though the earlier conversations had left an indelible mark on everyone present. The woman with the pearls spoke again, her voice quiet but resolute. "My father used to say that the hardest part of progress isn't building something new. It's letting go of the old ways that no longer serve us." Elijah nodded, her words resonating deeply. He was right, he said. "Change requires us to confront not just the world around us, but the world within ourselves. And that's the hardest part." As the plane touched down, Elijah felt a strange mixture of relief and resolve. The flight had been more than just a journey from one city to another. It had been a microcosm of the world he navigated every day. A world where progress was fought for inch by inch, conversation by conversation. As the plane taxied to the gate, Elijah glanced out the window at the runway lights, their steady glow a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always a path forward. He straightened in his seat, his gaze steady as he prepared to face whatever came next. The work was never done, but neither was the hope that fueled it. The plane rolled to a stop at the gate, and the cabin filled with the sounds of movement, the snap of seat belts releasing, the rustle of bags being pulled from under seats, the collective hum of people eager to disembark. Elijah Wright stayed seated, his notebook resting closed on his lap. Around him, passengers gathered their belongings with practiced efficiency, but the air still carried the weight of the unspoken. Elijah looked out the window one last time. The runway lights shimmered against the evening sky, faintly blurred by the thin veil of the airplane's frost-covered glass. It was an image that reminded him of so many journeys before this one, of the physical distance traveled and the invisible weight carried. "Excuse me, Mr. Wright," Laura, the flight attendant, said softly as she approached his seat. Her tone was quiet, almost hesitant. "Yes?" Elijah replied, meeting her gaze. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "For your patience, and for handling things the way you did." Elijah nodded, sensing the layers beneath her words. "Thank you, Laura," he said simply. "It's part of the journey." She lingered a moment, as if searching for something more to say, before offering a faint smile and moving down the aisle. Across the cabin, Charles Harrington stood, his movements brisk and purposeful. His face betrayed a blend of frustration and discomfort, though he avoided meeting Elijah's gaze. As he adjusted his suit jacket, he cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the low hum of the cabin. "Have a good evening, Mr. Wright," he said, his tone neutral but pointed. Elijah looked up, holding Charles's gaze for a brief moment. "You too, Mr. Harrington," he replied, his voice steady. There was no malice in Elijah's response. Only the quiet dignity that had carried him through the flight. For all Charles's posturing, for all his attempts to assert control over the narrative, it was clear who had emerged with their integrity intact. As passengers began filing out of the plane, the woman with the pearls, whose name Elijah still didn't know, paused by his seat. "Mr. Wright," she said, her voice tentative but warm, "I just want to say, thank you, for being so gracious, and for reminding us that sometimes, the hardest conversations are the most important ones." Elijah nodded, offering her a small smile. "Thank you," he said, "it's those conversations that move us forward." She hesitated, then added, "You've given me a lot to think about. And that's where it starts," Elijah said. She nodded, her eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and something deeper. Perhaps the weight of a lesson learned too late. The stream of passengers continued, each exchange with Elijah a quiet testament to the impact of the flight. Sophia, the young tech developer, stopped to thank him again, her voice brimming with admiration. Tom, the businessman, offered his business card and a firm handshake, his demeanor markedly more respectful than when the flight began. But it was Mrs. Caldwell, the elderly woman with the southern accent, who lingered longest. She stood by his seat, her hands clutching a small notebook, her face lined with emotion. "You remind me of my Henry," she said, her voice soft but steady. "He always believed in treating people with respect. No matter what, he would have liked you." Elijah felt a lump rise in his throat, but he managed a smile. "Thank you," he said, "that means a lot." She nodded, then opened her notebook and tore out a page, handing it to him. "If you're ever in Atlanta," she said, "our church book club would love to hear from you. You have a perspective we need to understand better." Elijah accepted the paper, tucking it into his pocket. "I'll think about it," he said, knowing that her invitation carried more than the weight of her words. As Elijah finally stepped into the terminal, the noise and chaos of the airport seemed almost comforting in its familiarity. The polished floors reflected the fluorescent lights above, and the distant echoes of announcements blended with the rhythmic clatter of suitcases on tile. He spotted a young black man near the baggage claim, dressed in a crisp suit and carrying a leather briefcase. The man's posture was careful, his movements deliberate, as if trying to project confidence while navigating an invisible minefield. Their eyes met briefly, and Elijah offered a small nod. The young man nodded back, his expression shifting from guarded to grateful in an instant. Elijah's phone buzzed as he reached the exit. It was a message from his wife. "Lisa, we're outside. Marcus and Olivia can't wait to see you." He smiled, the thought of his children washing away the lingering tension of the flight. As he stepped through the glass doors and into the crisp evening air, he spotted them, Lisa holding a handmade sign that read, "Welcome home, Dad," in bright, glittery letters, Marcus bouncing excitedly on his toes, and Olivia clutching a stuffed animal. Elijah quickened his pace, his briefcase swinging at his side as he reached them. Marcus ran to him first, wrapping his arms around Elijah's waist. "Dad, did you see my math problem? Mom sent you the picture." "I did," Elijah said, ruffling his son's hair, "and I'm so proud of you." Olivia reached up, demanding to be picked up. "Daddy, I made the sign," she announced proudly, pointing to the glittery creation in Lisa's hands. Elijah scooped her up, holding her close as Lisa approached. She smiled at him, her eyes full of understanding. "Rough flight?" she asked quietly. "Eventful," Elijah said, his voice low, "but I'm home now." As they walked toward the car, Elijah felt the weight of the day lifting, replaced by the grounding warmth of his family. He thought about the flight, the conversations, the small moments of connection and resistance. He knew the work was far from over, but for now, he was content to be present, to be home, because in a world that often demanded so much just to exist, home was where he could simply be.